We are with Zhou from CGTN, who has touched down in India 4 nights ago. Zhou, thank you so much for joining us on NDTV. You've been a veteran through the Wuhan coronavirus crisis as well. Thanks to you, we've had reports from Ground Zero. But talking about the G20 Leaders Summit in particular. Now, many people I've been speaking to, they've been telling me that the most conspicuous and telling absence at this summit in New Delhi is that of the Chinese president. Does his absence put a question mark over any sort of consensus?
Well, I would not say that President Xi's absence here would be the very effective factors to the success of G20, because China has been very supportive of India's presidency over many priorities on this year's agenda. For example, like supporting more voices for the global south, and also reform the multilateralism, and also climate actions. A lot of issues, and the priorities could go on the list. But at the same time, I think what Premier Li is wanted to stressing, as we heard from this morning sessions, is that China wants to work with the developing countries and BRICS countries. I think they have a similar mission to promote the prosperity for all, and I think this echo what the G20 host nation is calling, which is we have one future within one family. So I think sometimes we would be like hijacked by those geopolitical tensions, which is not supposed to be on the agenda if China is hosting this, because, for example, like Ukraine crisis, in my understanding, actually is now under a context of ideological confrontation, I would say. So just the same reason, because I think some of the Western countries are expecting India to choose a position if it is supporting Russia to have its aggression over Ukraine. So that's the reason why I think China and India are making the same advocate about peace talks, respecting the territorial integrity and sovereignty. But of course, I don't think both China and India are not supporting the escalation of the tension in the region, because we have some other more priorities for all the humans. So let's try to focus on, because G20 in its essence is all about economic recovery, and so the challenges in this regard are even more formidable for those developing countries. So I think China has been introducing its infrastructure plan or experience on alleviating poverty, and I think India has the similar agenda or roadmap for its development. So either within the BRICS mechanism or within the G20 mechanism, we have more voices from Global South now, with the African Union now joining the family. So I think this is also those priorities in common for the both countries. So I think the two countries, either who is coming, but I think the two sides are maintaining a good, smooth communication, either on the border issues or the population issues, or the tech, or this even space cooperation. So I think this is more important, I think, for both two leaders. I think two leaders have the kind of like strategic wisdom to deal with this. So yeah, that's what I've seen.
Right. Many geo-analysts, though, have pointed out that Xi Jinping's absence is signaling that the East is rising and the West is falling. Also, it may be solidarity with Vladimir Putin. What are the thoughts back home?
Well, China now, I think, particularly in the past 2 years, has been caught in the Ukraine crisis. So I think the Western bloc has been putting China into the same camp with Russia, and they wanted to just remove China as a leadership of the global South. That's the reason why I think the Ukraine crisis has been, like, as I said, in the context of ideological confrontation. But still, I just wanted to go back to the economic recovery, because I think either Premier Li or Chinese President Xi Jinping, I think they're both looking at how to make sure that we can restore confidence in the global economic recovery. So China actually are stepping up its efforts in promoting global security initiative, global development initiative, or global civilization initiative. So, and I think that's one of the China's efforts to try to make sure that we can achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Goal under the UN framework. So in this regard, I think China can still be a great partner in promoting what India has been working on. So I think this is also a time to try to shelve these disputes. But at the same time, I think the two sides have to maintain the good relationships and just let the public know that we're good.
You know, the old diplomatic saying goes, if you're not on the table, you're on the menu. Is there a worry that Xi Jinping might be impacted politically by being absent at the G20 Leaders Summit in New Delhi?
Well, I would say that it would have some impact because I think as we discussed today, most of the media reports are talking about she's not coming to New Delhi. Instead, Premier Li is here. So I think this is kind of like diplomatic saying that because I think from our philosophy, actually, we're trying our best to show that China is a responsible country or a responsible power in the region in terms of its development plan. So I think this is also shared by the U.S. actually because, during the Trump administration, actually the U.S. has withdrawn from the UNESCO, but now the United States rejoined for its own interest because now the UN is taking to the next step about climate crisis. So there could be some insights or some rules talking about the climate change. So that's the reason why the U.S. wanted to see that its interests could be taken care. So I think the reason why I would not go into the reason why President Xi is not coming. She has his on schedule, but I think what we've seen or what we've heard from the Chinese leadership here at the G20 summit is still consistent. So I think this is more important because when the diplomatic relations come into a really crisis between either it is the bilateral ties or the multilateral ties, any side should be really consistent in its the vows or the promise. So I think China has been trying to play such a role to make sure that the regional stability and prosperity could be one effort that the country can contribute.
Also, Joe, what's the sentiment back home? In Beijing, what is India viewed as? What does our future look like?
Well, I think it comes at a time when the treated water coming from the Fukushima nuclear power plant. So I think mostly the mood back in China is all about China-Japan relations, but it's totally different because I think China and India share the border for centuries, and I think the two countries really have shared a really friendly relation. So people.
But many say our relationship is the lowest it's been since the 1980s. Do you agree?
Well, I think the disputes actually at the border between the two countries have been for years, and we've seen back in 2017 or 2020. But I think Chinese people are kind of inclined to the narrative of the government. So I think. But now, actually, I think the government hasn't. I mean, Beijing hasn't been stir up the tensions between China and India, which is totally different from what we see, as I said, between China and Japan. So, if you see from this spectrum, that I think China has been, downplaying the border tensions between the two countries, so that we are not seeing that rising tensions or aggression from the Chinese people against Indian people. But anyway, as journalists, we have this kind of the issues. But I think it needs time. So now the two sides or the defense ministry are trying to maintain these dialogues. I think they have already had several dozen of dialogue. So I hope that this dispute could be solved as soon as possible. Yeah.
Well, we certainly hope so too, because it's all about peace and harmony at the end of the day. Just as we wrap, Joe, India's African outreach. We've heard the Prime Minister's comments earlier today during the inaugural remarks for the G20 Leaders Summit. Now, China already has a growing footprint in Africa. You got there first. Does India's outreach to the African nations pose as a threat to Beijing?
Well, I think, as I said, China has been very consistent in its development plan. It has its global development plan. It's not about who comes first, who comes later. I think the colonial comes first. That's the reason why the Western country, when it sees that the China influence in Africa is growing, or in Latin America, the same growing, but it sees as the counter presence against Western countries. But the same. But it's totally different from China's and India's. I think China welcomes any BRICS countries to try to expand its influence or expand its, I would say, now we are talking about how to make sure that the financial and monetary policy or reform could be discussed among BRICS countries. So that's the reason why we can just stay kind of free from US sanctions or this, again, the economic crisis back in 2008. So I think that the BRICS country, I think they have maintained they have the consensus to make sure that their footprint in any developing countries could benefit the people on the ground. So I don't think China sees, or India should seize, it is coming first or not. So they wanted to have the shared future. So let's just work that out together.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. We've covered a lot. Thank you so much for providing us deeper insight into what Beijing is thinking. Thank you so much for joining us on NDTV.
Thank you.